Well, I don't have any presentation. I'll just really tell a story. The title of my paper is Recollections of a Former Boredom Scholar. You can all hear me well? Great.
Yes.
I never intended to become a boredom scholar, and I was one for a very short time. And when I wrote my small book in the spring of 1999, there was no such thing as a field called boredom studies. There were a couple of monographs, especially Martin Dörlemann's Langeweile, Deutung eines verbreiteten Phänomens from 1991. And I think that was a pioneering work that really deserves more attention, but perhaps his timing was a bit off, as happens with good books all the time. And there was Patricia Meyer-Spack's Boredom, The Literary History of a State of Mind from 1995, but that also failed to have much of a wider impact. I should also mention Oren Clapp's Overload and Boredom from 1986, and certainly Reinhard Kuhn's Demon of the Noontide from 1976. There were some psychological studies on boredom proneness, and there was Heidegger's ambitious analysis of boredom in his 1929-1930 lectures. But it's striking that there are only a handful of works dedicated specifically to boredom among the 200 titles in the bibliography at the end of my book. As Aristotle pointed out in the Nicomachean Ethics, one swallow does not make a summer, neither does one day, and a few scattered works on boredom does not make a scholarly field. I didn't know anybody else who was working on boredom. The internet back in the late 1990s wasn't what it is today, so there was no digital community to draw on. Digital accessibility to journals was also rather underdeveloped at the time. And this partly explains the somewhat eclectic selection of sources in the book. I was an avid reader, and since I had so little regular boredom research to draw on, I just pieced together a picture drawing on stuff that I had already read. So if somebody wonders why German Romanticism has such a prominent place in the book, the answer is simply that I had read a lot of German Romanticism. In addition to that, I wanted to break free of the strict format I had followed in my PhD dissertation. And that's why I placed pop music alongside Kant and Heidegger in my sources, and a couple of novels. And why not throw in a movie for good measure? Whereas my PhD dissertation had been all too pure, I really wanted this small book to be very impure. But why did I write it in the first place? Because I was bored, of course. I was especially bored by philosophy, but I was really bored by everything. And here I should perhaps add some biographical background, even though I refuse to do so in the book itself. And usually I don't do that in my books. I grew up in a small industrial town not far from Oslo in Norway. My father was a plumber in a shipyard, which was the largest company in the city, and he had worked there since he started as an apprentice at the age of 14 after 7 years of elementary school. My mother worked in the welfare office, also with 7 years of elementary school. Books were not a part of my upbringing, and I was probably the first person in my family who voluntarily opened a book. It happened a bit by chance. I was 16 or 17 at the time, so I was a really late starter. I started reading books really late. And then I moved on from fiction to philosophy, and entering the world of philosophy was a bit of a revelation for me. I find it incredibly satisfying to think thoughts I had not thought before. It was such a huge kick for me. I had no plans for an academic career. If anything, my only plan was not to have an academic career, but I found philosophy incredibly interesting. So the fact that I ended up with an academic career is just a side effect of my interest in philosophy. I might also add that in addition to philosophy, one of my main interests was partying, and I guess that I devoted approximately the same time to partying and to philosophy. And then to music, of course, which always was and still is my main interest. I'm far more interested in music than in philosophy. That's why I refuse to write about music. Never make your main interest into your job. Anyway, finding philosophy was a momentous change in my life. I loved it. I did not care much for the university because there were too many sharp elbows, too many people who suffered from the illusion that life is a zero-sum game, and that wasn't to my liking. I didn't want to play that game. So it is somewhat paradoxical that I've made my living as an academic philosopher at a university for over 30 years now, more than half of my life. But what can I say? I was young. I needed the money. Uh, but I had more or less decided to leave academic life just as I began writing this little thing on boredom. I had had a very generous scholarship for 4 years, and I thought that it was time to move on. I had submitted my PhD dissertation on Kant's theoretical philosophy, more precisely on the schematism, and thus fulfilled my obligations. It would be an exaggeration to say that the work on the dissertation had been characterized by enthusiasm. On the contrary, it hardly filled me with anything but boredom. Still, I worked hard on that dissertation, and I've never put as much effort into anything else I've written. So there is no contradiction between working hard at something and being deeply bored by it. As Fernanda Pessoa pointed out, the boredom of great effort is perhaps the heaviest boredom to bear. Perhaps the most important reason why I carried out the work was that I feared appearing as a failure, as someone who was not up to par with the task he had applied for and been given. The problem was that I no longer saw any point in writing this dissertation on Kant. It appeared to be a monstrous effort to do something that simply did not matter. I no longer cared about what I was writing about, but I obviously cared enough not to appear a failure. But I've never even considered publishing that dissertation as a book. It was dead for me. The very instance I submitted it, it was dead to me before that. And philosophy struck me as especially meaningless, perhaps because it had been a particularly meaningful part of my life. So there was an acute sense of loss. The philosophy I had done for quite some time did not resonate with my mood. I was deeply bored, and the detailed analysis of Kant's theory of schematism that I was writing was of no apparent relevance for coming to terms with this boredom. I could go through the motions, lay out arguments, refer to the vast amount of commentaries on the schematism, dig up new material from Kant's Nachlass and so on, but it simply did not matter to me. And when I finally completed my dissertation, well before my scholarship ended, I thought that I could enjoy life. I had a full salary for months to come and no tasks. However, it turned out that not only was the work on the thesis a source of boredom, everything seemed to bore me. Even music was not able to arouse much more than a yawn. Even partying bored me. The world bored me. And not the least, I bored myself. I was the most boring person I could think of. And had I gone to see a psychiatrist, I would probably have been diagnosed with a clinical depression, as I certainly satisfied several of the criteria in the diagnostic manuals. But I would have objected to such a diagnosis, because I did not see myself as depressed. I saw myself as deeply bored. I believed that my ailment was philosophical rather than psychiatric. I thought that I was not suffering from, for instance, a chemical imbalance, which could and should be remedied by the use of antidepressants or something like that. I rather saw myself as suffering from a deficiency of meaning, which could and should be remedied by an existential reorientation in life. A reorientation I believed that philosophy could shed light on. And I thought that perhaps my boredom was akin to a voice of conscience telling me that I needed to change my life. It wasn't that I thought that the world no longer had any meaning to offer, but any such meaning wasn't available to me. I couldn't orient myself properly in whatever meaning might be there. And as Ludwig Wittgenstein points out, a philosophical problem is ultimately about a lack of orientation. Philosophy, as I see it, is ultimately about self-reflection. So I had to get that in order. So I chose to use the tools I had acquired studying philosophy in order to see if they might help me come to terms with my affliction, using philosophy and fiction as my therapy. And that became a book. And the pent-up frustration almost ran out of my fingers that it had resulted in a finished manuscript called A Philosophy of Boredom just 3 months later. The book was literally self-help. I tried to help myself to get out of this affliction. I had not given any thought to publication, but then by accident an editor at Scandinavian University Press that I knew asked if I was writing anything at the moment, and then when I said that, well, I'm writing on this little thing on boredom, he asked me if I was willing to publish it, and my reply was, okay, but nobody's gonna read it. So that was my expectation of the book, and nobody was more surprised than me when it went straight into the best-selling charts and sold 15,000 copies in Norway alone, which is a pretty small book market. And of course, that was nice. But the most important thing about writing the book was that it revived philosophy for me. Not only was writing about boredom not boring, it filled me for the first time in years with an enormous joy in philosophy. Writing this book made it possible for me to continue to do philosophy, but I had to do it more the way I did it on the book on boredom and less in the way that I did it in my dissertation on Kant. Now, of course, Norway is just this remote place up north, and when my book was published in English translation 5 or 6 years later, I thought that the book had already, for the most part, run its course. I had an agent, and he had huge problems finding a publisher for the book, and many rejections. And when he finally found one, I really had to fight hard to keep the third part of the book, the one devoted to the phenomenology of boredom, which I really saw as an essential part of the philosophical backbone of the book. I had to fight hard to keep that because my publisher thought that that part alone would destroy all possibilities of the book of finding a market. Fortunately, my publisher was wrong. And that English translation was essential for the book to reach other markets. There had been 7 or 8 translations of the book prior to the English one, but after the English one, there were another 20 languages. So the book took off. However, when all of this happened, I had already moved on to other topics. Actually, I had written and published 5 books on completely different topics in the meantime, on evil, art, philosophy of biology, fashion, and so on. So when the English translation was published almost at the same time as Elizabeth Goodstein's excellent Experience Without Qualities, Boredom and Modernity, by then I had already left the field, or rather, the not yet existing field, years ago. So, when I, at the beginning of this lecture, said that I was a boredom scholar only for a very short time, I could have been more precise and said that I was a boredom scholar for approximately 3 months in the spring of 1999. And when I finished my little manuscript, I had gotten the sort of grasp of the phenomenon that I needed. I had, in fact, managed to help myself. And for me, that also meant that I didn't have to continue to study boredom. I could move on to other frustrating topics. Um, and I've never liked repeating myself too much. And those who have invited me to contribute to anthologies or special editions of journals devoted to boredom, well, they can attest to the fact that I've usually been more than a little bit reluctant to do so. And this also goes for the lecture or a presentation I'm having right now. I believe that my response to the organizers were, quote, "I don't want to be the boring old fart doing outdated stuff." I believe that was my direct reply when I was asked to give this little talk. Because the field has clearly progressed so much since I wrote my book 26 years ago. Lots of interesting work seems to be done, such as Marius' presentation right before me. And I have no interest in being a gatekeeper, standing in the way for people who present fresh approaches. And I might add that I've been asked a couple of times to write a Philosophy of Boredom version 2.0. But why on earth should I do that? I've only published 2 articles on boredom after my old book, and they were both devoted to correcting what I saw as serious flaws in that book. And the 2 flaws were related. And looking back at my book now, of course, I see it was the work of a very young man, which is fine. But I think it's astonishing that I never gave anything even resembling a proper account of meaning in a book that had as its central thesis that boredom consists in a lack of personal meaning. I mean, I think that's astonishing. There was an implicit account there, and that implicit account of meaning was, I believe, mistaken. More specifically, my notion of meaning was far too intellectualistic, too tied to linguistic meaning, even though I made a feeble attempt to distinguish between them in the book. Now, I believe, basically, I think that meaning should be analyzed in terms of caring. The sort of meaning we discuss in this context differs from meaning as discussed by philosophical semantics. We're talking about existential meaning, something related to the observation of some sort of point to our lives. And there are etymological reasons for tying boredom to caring. And we get a clue from this pre-modern variety of boredom called acedia. The Latin word stems from the Greek acedia, which is a combination of the privative prefix and kedos. And kedos literally means caring about something. So acedia is, according to its etymology, about not caring about something. And I've tried to flesh out this notion of caring in a few other works, especially in the third and final part of the book, A Philosophy of Freedom. But I've also done so in an article entitled Boredom and Meaning in Life. I will not go into too much detail here, but tying meaning to caring loosens the relation to language. Explaining what it means to care about something is no straightforward task, but I analyze caring to a great extent along similar lines as Harry Frankfurt. To care about something means that we value it, that we regard it, broadly speaking, as something we desire. And that desire, furthermore, is regarded as a desire that we desire to have. This desire is no passing fancy, but rather something with which we identify and see as an expression of who we are. So an act of caring makes the world a meaningful place. It gives our life some sort of direction. And loosening meaning from language made it possible to correct a really stupid claim I made in the book, namely that non-human animals are incapable of boredom, which I felt was an astonishing mistake, considering the fact that I've had animals my entire life. And if you hear any noises beside me, it's just my dog who's lying on the couch behind me dreaming. She's an old lady, a whippet, 13 years old. She can certainly be bored. I mean, we have little reason to believe that any non-human animals have a capacity for proper language, and that includes even the most meticulously trained primates. So one is therefore forced either to provide an account of animal boredom that does not employ the concept of meaning, or give an account of meaning that does not presuppose language, if one believes that non-human animals can in fact be bored, as I do. So I chose, in the old book, I chose the first alternative, namely to exclude animals, non-human animals, from the realm of boredom. And in order to correct that, I wrote an entire book entitled Understanding Animals and an article entitled Animal Boredom. Because many non-human animals clearly have a capacity for caring about various objects and activities. But what they care about will, to a great extent, differ from species to species. So we can then define animal boredom in terms of being deprived of objects and activities for which they care. And just like a creature who has the capacity to feel love for another creature will have a capacity for feeling lonely, a creature who has the capacity to care for something will also have a capacity for being bored. And in both cases, the negative state is characterized by privation, by a lack of attachment and lack of meaning. And that article on animal boredom is probably the last thing I'll ever write on boredom. The one possible exception might be an article on boredom and hope, as I briefly touched on their relation in a book on hope. And I think that there's a bit more to be said about that. Maybe I'll get around to write something about boredom and hope at some point. As for me, I no longer find life in general boring. That sort of all-comprehensive boredom has not returned since I wrote the book. In fact, life is for the most part anything but boring. Of course, I still find certain movies, novels, records, and people boring, but that's more of an exception than the rule. But it's puzzling, I still find most philosophy boring. Boring philosophy, like a boring movie, fills you with emptiness. Boring philosophy fills your time, but you simply do not seem to find anything to care about there. However, to say that you're bored by something because it does not interest you or you do not care about it doesn't amount to much. The obvious question is then, why doesn't it interest you? And Nietzsche starts his essay on the uses and disadvantages of history for life with a quotation from Goethe. And the quotation goes as such. In any case, I hate everything that merely instructs me without augmenting or directly invigorating my activity. The main point in Nietzsche's essay is that the writing of history should serve the interests of the living, not the dead. And I would argue that the same should hold for philosophy. Unfortunately, most of the academic philosophy written today in both the analytic and the continental tradition, serves neither the living nor the dead. It serves nobody. It simply does not have much relevance for anyone. And that is probably why it is so often excruciatingly boring. All worthwhile philosophy builds on something pre-philosophical. Something precedes philosophical reflection, something found in experiences which form the basis for such reflection. In this respect, philosophy itself is understood as the act of reflecting on a meaning or experience that already exists. Philosophy takes its content and legitimacy from what is already experienced, but only vaguely understood. And this is methodologically significant because it requires philosophy to maintain contact with the pre-philosophical if it is to retain its legitimacy. But when we philosophize, we tend to lose ourselves in greater and greater abstractions that become steadily less tangible. Ultimately, we often remain lost in abstraction and therefore lose sight of the concrete experience that was the basis for our initial reflection. And then we are left with a philosophy lacking in experience, and such a philosophy is missing something crucial, a relation to its own origin. Contemporary philosophers read too many books and articles and make too few experiences. Or they are incapable of making experience relevant for philosophy or philosophy relevant for experience. Too much philosophical writing is so self-contained. It has lost its relation to the pre-philosophical, which gives real life and substance to philosophy, and also lost its relation to the post-philosophical, to the real impact philosophy should have on our lives. And I think a huge part of the reason why my old little book somehow worked was that it grew directly out of an experience that I had to try to come to terms with at a point when there was no such thing as boredom studies. If I were to write a philosophy of boredom version 2.0 now, it would probably be a really boring book because I'm just not properly attuned to the topic. It's really not quite my topic anymore, but it's great to see that so much goes on in the field and that so much engaging work is being done. So I guess my final words here is keep up the good work. Well, that was pretty much the little story I had to tell.
Thank you very much, Lars, for that story and presentation and historical overview of your work and the book. We have time for questions. I'll try to moderate, but I don't think I'm necessary. You can put them in the chat or you can raise your arm and we can take it from there.
Thank you, Lars. Yeah, I really like Stanley. That was deep. My questions, maybe a bit of a curveball question, but how would you link? It seems that all your philosophy ofs are linked. The philosophy of work, the philosophy of boredom, the philosophy of ease. Yeah. Could you talk a wee bit about that? How you see boredom fitting in with them?
Yeah, of course. Usually when I write a book, I think that now I'm going to do something completely different. So that's for instance, after doing my book on evil, I wrote a book on fashion. What's the furthest I can get from evil? I'll do a book on fashion to sort of clear out my head. But then I see that of course the book on fashion is to a huge extent about so many of the same topics as was in the older book on boredom, with the very logic of fashion that permeates social life, the eternal recurrence of the new, the substitution logic, driving consumption, tying in with Marius's presentation earlier. Sure. and work. That entire book on work is about meaning in work. And the book on freedom, that's really where I think I sort of get a better grip on what I mean by meaning. So perhaps we could say that meaning is the dominating thread throughout these works, and then I see how that plays out in different topics. Yeah. When I write them, I usually think that I'm doing something completely different from what I did before, but then afterwards I can see, nah, they tie in together. Yeah.
Lars' search for meaning. Yeah.
Yeah. The constant search for meaning.
Yeah. Thank you.
It gave me an idea. I suppose we could have a series of essays how we start to deal with boredom, how I am becoming boredom researcher. Yeah, a series of essays. Yeah. And maybe it will turn out that we all deal with boredom because of our own boredom with life, with studies, with anything else. So this is the starting point. And the cure.
What better reason for writing about boredom could there be?
Yeah, you write your boredom down in a way. So if you put your boredom into the paper, into the manuscript, you're free of boredom. So maybe we are a therapeutic group, actually.
Yeah.
What do you think, Josepa? Yeah, maybe this is therapeutic group. We deal with boredom, we discuss boredom, we write about boredom just to cure our own predicaments with boredom.
What about the risk society? It's one of the things that's not really come up that much and for my line of work, boredom and risk, boredom and crime, boredom and constraint causes one of risk. How does it play into it for you?
Yeah, well, what was Philip Larkin's old formulation? Life is first boredom, then fear. I think it's interesting that we live in a society that on the one hand is obsessed with risk and the elimination of every risk, sort of zero tolerance for risk. To be at risk in any form or shape is in a way unacceptable. So we organize our societies in such a way as to reduce that risk to the greatest extent we can achieve. On the other hand, we see so much that we then have all these activities, extreme sports, for instance, or a lot of video games and so on, in which we actively engage with the sort of activities and material that would be likely to generate some level of fear in us. So we try to, from this risk society in which we sort of have fear as this cultural prism through which we evaluate everything. I mean, the first question that comes to mind whenever a new phenomenon emerges, how dangerous is it? Rather than how beneficial might it be? So we're obsessed with handling risk. And yet at the other time, there is a growing field of how to escape the confines of the no risk society. That being said, at the moment, living in a no risk world really isn't an option. But a couple of years ago, it looked like that. But it's pretty hasty now. You, Josefa?
Yeah, thank you, Lars. This is a non-profound question at all, okay? But I'm curious. Has the fact of having spent some time reflecting on animal boredom changed the way you see your pets now? how is your relationship with them now? And do you try to create some more meaningful moments for them, and how?
Actually, I think I relate to my pets exactly as I've always done. I mean, I'm a huge animal lover, and I think that anybody who reads my book on animal minds, in which this old lady who's sleeping behind there figures a lot, see that I've very deep emotional attachment to animals. What I think was so strange was that when I wrote the book originally, somehow I did not allow what I knew perfectly well to enter into my philosophy. So in a way, because it didn't add up to my conceptual framework, I decided to just sort of set up a wall between my everyday experience and the conceptual apparatus. So I think that was such a weird thing that I wrote that, and I was stubborn. I continued to claim that for years on, until I finally gave in. So in the terminology of my latest book, I was a stupid idiot for quite some time in that regard.
Oh, thank you, Lars.
Thank you, everybody, for your participation in this session. And